James Whittaker sat on the cold, hard bench of his cell, staring blankly at the wall. The harsh fluorescent lights above hummed incessantly, the only sound in the otherwise silent space. His mind raced through the events of his past, mistakes, regrets, and the choices that had led him to this moment. In just a few hours, the door of his cell would open, and he would be led to face his execution. The weight of it all felt suffocating, but it was not the fear of death that consumed him now. It was the thought of what he was leaving behind, of the people he had hurt, and the one creature who had never judged him: his dog, Daisy. Before the walls of prison had closed around him, James and Daisy had been inseparable. She was a golden retriever with an infectious smile and a wagging tail that could light up even the darkest of days. Daisy had been there through it all, when he was living his best life, and when things began to spiral out of control. She had been his constant, offering unconditional love in a world where trust was hard to come by. But that was before his arrest, before everything came crashing down. The day the prison warden had come to inform him of his execution had felt unreal, as though he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. But it wasn't until that moment, sitting in the stark silence of his cell, knowing he had no more time, that he realized there was one final thing he needed to ask for. Something that had been gnawing at his heart, a simple request that felt like his only chance to hold on to something real before his time ran out. With shaky hands, James grabbed the small slip of paper the prison guard had given him for last-minute requests. He had seen others ask for lavish meals or specific religious rituals, but none of that mattered to him now. He wasn't interested in the food or the ceremony. His final request was simple, but it carried more weight than any meal or prayer ever could. "I want to see Daisy," James wrote, the words trembling on the paper. It was a quiet request, one that seemed so trivial compared to the gravity of the situation. But to him, it meant everything. Daisy was the one thing that had never judged him, never turned away from him. Her love was pure, untainted by his mistakes. She had been the one who waited for him at the door every day, tail wagging, as though he had done nothing wrong. When he handed the slip to the guard, the officer looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and sympathy. No one had ever made such a request before. It was unorthodox, even by the standards of death row. But James couldn't bring himself to care. He had nothing left to lose. The only thing that mattered now was seeing Daisy one last time, to hold her in his arms, to feel her warm presence as a reminder of the life he once had. "Please," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "just let me see her one last time." As the guard nodded and left, James felt a small flicker of hope rise within him. It might have been a long shot, but at that moment, it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The request was out of the ordinary, and prison officials were caught off guard by it. The rules were clear. No animals were allowed inside the high security walls. The idea of granting such a request seemed unfathomable to most of the staff. Prison was a place for punishment, not for sentimental gestures. The officers who processed last-minute requests had seen everything from extravagant meals to requests for family visits, but nothing like this. A dog? That was absurd. Yet something about James' simple plea tugged at the hearts of those who heard it. The warden, a gruff man who had been hardened by years of overseeing the prison, sat back in his chair, staring at the request with a frown. He had been running the facility for over a decade, and he had never once encountered a final wish like this. His eyes flicked back and forth from the slip of paper to the clock on the wall and to the guards who were waiting for his decision. It was clear they were all anxious, uncertain of what this could mean. "I've never heard of anything like this," the warden muttered to himself. "It's not in the rules." One of the senior guards, a man named Officer Reynolds, stood up from his desk, his arms crossed in thought. "It's a dog, sir. It's not even a request for food or family. How could we possibly allow it? It's too risky. Animals in this facility would be a security nightmare." But the warden wasn't so sure. Something about the image of James, sitting in his cell, asking for nothing more than a last moment with the dog that had stood by him, stirred something inside him. In a job that was often defined by rules and routine, this felt different. "You might be right," the warden said, glancing at Officer Reynolds. But this is his last request. What harm could a dog do? There's got to be something we can do. The thought of denying the request lingered in his mind, but the idea of granting it felt more human. He wasn't sure if it was the idea of mercy, or perhaps the flicker of compassion that had long been absent from his role, but he didn't want to be the man who crushed the final ounce of humanity from James. After a long silence, the warden made his decision. He would allow it, but there would be conditions, strict ones. A dog would not simply be allowed into the facility without precaution. The animal would be examined, kept under control, and only allowed into the prison yard with the utmost supervision. "I'll make a call," the warden said firmly, "and we'll arrange for it. But I want every step to be documented. No exceptions. I want every officer on standby." Officer Reynolds, though still uneasy, nodded reluctantly. There was no arguing with the warden's decision. However unorthodox, it was final. Meanwhile, James had no idea that his request was under serious review. He had given his plea, and now he could do nothing but wait. His heart pounded in his chest, desperate for hope. As the hours dragged on, he clung to the thought of seeing Daisy again, praying that, somehow, the impossible would become a reality. The morning light filtered through the shelter's windows, casting soft beams on the rows of cages where abandoned dogs slept or watched visitors with longing eyes. Daisy, an aging golden retriever, sat by the window, her once vibrant coat now dull with age and wear. Her fur was still thick and soft, but her movements had slowed down considerably in the past year. She had been rescued from a shelter years before, and her bond with James had been immediate. He was the one who had given her a home, the one who had taken her on long walks, played fetch, and whispered secrets to her when the world felt too heavy. Now Daisy spent her days at this shelter, the same place where she had once spent her early days before James took her in. The volunteers had taken great care of her, ensuring she had everything she needed, but it wasn't the same. She missed him, his scent, his touch, the way he'd look at her with warmth and affection. She would lie by the door and wait for him to return, tail wagging, as though she expected him to walk through at any moment. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and he never came back. It had been nearly a year since James was arrested, and in that time, the shelter had grown accustomed to Daisy's routine. She was a sweet dog, but she had an air of quiet sadness about her. She didn't bark much, didn't play like the other dogs. She simply watched, waiting. And then that day, everything changed. The phone call came early in the morning. The shelter coordinator, Sarah, was just finishing her coffee when she answered the ringing phone. Her eyes widened as she listened, the words barely registering at first. It was the prison asking about Daisy. The request was strange, almost surreal. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, but there was a sense of urgency that made Sarah's heart race. "Is this Daisy, the golden retriever?" the officer asked. Yes, it is." What's this about?" Sarah stammered, confusion and disbelief setting in. The officer explained the situation, the request from James Woodtaker, an inmate on death row who had asked to see his dog one last time. It was a final wish, something that had never been asked of the prison before. But the decision had been made. They would bring Daisy to the prison for a brief visit, under tight supervision, of course. As Sarah listened, her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Daisy hadn't seen James in over a year. Could she even remember him? Could a dog, after so much time apart, still feel that unbreakable bond? The thought seemed impossible, yet something told her that Daisy, with her gentle soul, would know him. She had waited so long. Minutes later, Sarah went to Daisy's kennel, her heart heavy. She knelt beside the dog, gently stroking her fur. Daisy looked up at her, eyes soft and trusting. "Guess what, girl?" Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly. "You're going to see James again." Daisy's ears perked up, her tail giving a single wag. Sarah smiled through the lump in her throat, feeling a strange sense of peace. Daisy didn't need to understand the full meaning of what was happening, but Sarah could feel that something deep inside the dog shifted. Daisy wasn't just a shelter dog today. She was a piece of someone's past, a lifeline to their heart. and soon she would be reunited with the one person who mattered most. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the prison yard as the moment of truth arrived. The guards had cleared the area, creating a small, secured space where the reunion would take place. The prison, usually a place of cold stone and metal, now felt almost surreal as the heavy door creaked open, allowing a small group of officers to step out, leading the van that carried Daisy. The air felt thick with anticipation, and even the guards seemed to hold their breath. James stood in the center of the yard, his hands bound by the cuffs that had been placed on him for the final time. He had been escorted by 2 officers, but they kept their distance, allowing him a brief moment of solitude. The yard was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. His heart hammered in his chest as he waited, unsure of what would happen next. What if Daisy didn't recognize him? What if she had forgotten him in the time they'd been apart? The thought gnawed at him, and he pushed it away. He couldn't let himself think like that. He needed to see her. He had to. The van's doors opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Daisy. She looked older, slower than the last time he had seen her. Her coat, once glossy and full, now had a dull sheen to it, and her movements were more deliberate. But when she spotted him, something changed. The hesitation that had clouded her steps melted away, replaced by an unmistakable spark of recognition. Her eyes locked onto him, and without a second thought, Daisy bolted toward him, her tail wagging furiously. James felt his breath catch in his throat as he dropped to his knees, the shackles around his wrists forgotten in the moment. His eyes welled up with tears as Daisy leaped into his arms, her body warm and familiar, her breath a comfort he had longed for. She pressed her face into his chest, the soft sound of her breathing filling the silence between them. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, and in that brief, precious moment, there was nothing but him and Daisy. "Daisy," he whispered, choking on the words. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I'm so sorry." Daisy didn't need to hear the words. She simply nuzzled his neck, her affection overwhelming in its simplicity. For the first time in a long while, James felt like he wasn't just a prisoner. He wasn't the man who had made mistakes or the man the world had written off. He was just a person, one who was loved and had loved in return. The guards who had been watching stood frozen, some with their arms crossed, others with hands pressed to their faces as they fought back their own emotions. The sight of the reunion was too powerful to ignore, and for a brief moment, even they saw James for who he truly was, not just an inmate on death row, but a man who had a life, a bond, and a love that transcended the cold steel walls of the prison. As James cradled Daisy in his arms, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had lost, but also the unexpected grace of the present moment. He didn't know what would happen after this, what his future would hold, but for now, all that mattered was Daisy. The dog who had loved him when no one else did, the one constant in his chaotic life. And she was here, with him, in this moment that would change everything. For what seemed like an eternity, James stayed on his knees, holding Daisy close, her warm body nestled against him. The sound of her breathing, slow and rhythmic, was the only thing grounding him in the chaotic swirl of emotions within him. He let his tears fall freely, not caring who saw or who judged. In this moment, he wasn't a criminal. He wasn't an inmate on death row. He was just a man who had loved a dog and been loved in return, and that connection was more powerful than any sentence could ever be. Daisy, as if sensing the depth of the moment, lay her head on his lap and looked up at him with gentle, knowing eyes. There was something so deeply comforting about her presence. Her eyes were filled with unconditional affection, untainted by time, regret, or the mistakes he had made. All the things that haunted him seemed to vanish when he was with her. In her eyes, he was still the man who had once walked beside her, cared for her, and promised to always be there. In that brief, fragile moment, there was peace. No guilt, no shame, just love. He ran his hand over her soft fur, the action instinctive, the rhythm of it soothing. His fingers traced the familiar lines of her coat, and the sound of her soft panting seemed to echo in his chest. How many times had he taken comfort in her presence? How many quiet evenings have they shared, with only the flickering of a lamp and the soft sound of her paws on the floor. Those memories rushed to him now, days that felt so distant but so vivid in his mind. The quiet mornings they spent together, the walks through the park, the way she would sit by the door waiting for him to come home. It all came rushing back, and it hurt deep in his chest to know that those days were over. But as he sat there, with Daisy resting in his lap, he realized something. This wasn't just a goodbye. It wasn't just a final, sorrowful moment before he would be taken away. It was a reminder of the love that still existed in the world, even in places like this. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were moments of light, moments of grace, of forgiveness, and of healing. Daisy had never judged him. She had never held his mistakes against him. She had loved him unconditionally, and for that, he was forever grateful. The guards, still standing around the perimeter of the yard, exchanged glances. Some were visibly moved by the sight, their stoic faces softened by the raw emotion of the moment. They had seen countless executions, heard countless pleas from inmates, but this was different. This wasn't just a man asking for a last meal or a religious service. This was a man at the end of his life, asking for the one thing that had kept him going through it all: his dog. And in that simple request, they saw something real, something human. James looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, directed not only at Daisy but to everyone who had allowed this moment to happen. No words could ever capture the depth of his gratitude. In his heart, he knew this was the last gift he would ever receive. And as he continued to hold Daisy, he felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. The moment James and Daisy shared on the prison yard did not go unnoticed. What had started as a quiet, personal wish between a man and his dog quickly rippled out into the world. News outlets, initially hesitant to report on such an unusual request, found themselves compelled by the story. Photos of the reunion began circulating, first among local media, and soon they were everywhere, on social media, blogs, and news websites across the country. The image of James kneeling on the prison yard, Daisy in his arms, became an emblem of something raw and vulnerable. It struck a chord with millions. People couldn't stop talking about it. The scene was tender, heart-wrenching, and undeniably human. It was a reminder that even those who had been written off, even those who had made terrible mistakes, could still experience love, connection, and redemption. James, once the subject of judgment and condemnation, was now seen in a new light by many. For a moment, he was no longer a criminal. He was just a man whose last wish was to see the dog who had loved him unconditionally. As the story spread, an unexpected wave of support began to form. Petitions demanding clemency for James flooded the internet. Online communities rallied behind the idea that if one last act of kindness could be allowed, maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something more. Many people began to question the justice of James' sentence. Was his crime unforgivable, or was there more to the story? The image of James holding Daisy seemed to suggest that, despite his past, there was still humanity within him, a humanity that deserved to be acknowledged. A prominent animal rights organization made a statement supporting James, arguing that the bond between humans and animals transcended the law. "This moment is a testament to the healing power of love," they said in a press release. "No matter where we come from or what we've done, the capacity to love and be loved is a gift we should all cherish. If one small act of mercy can show us the way, we should consider that when we look at James Whittaker." Meanwhile, a growing number of legal experts began to scrutinize James' case. People started talking about the idea of restorative justice, an approach that emphasized rehabilitation and understanding over punishment. Was it possible that James had changed over the years? Could his work with animals and his bond with Daisy be a sign of redemption? The conversation shifted from his past to the possibility of his future. The media attention reached its peak when a major national news network decided to interview the warden who had allowed the reunion to take place. The warden, typically a figure who avoided public attention, was now at the center of a heated debate. I've been in this job for over 20 years, the warden said, his voice calm yet firm. And I've never seen anything like this. It's not just about rules and regulations. It's about what it means to be human. We allowed James this one moment, and it changed everything. If nothing else, it reminded us that even in the darkest places, there's still light. The flood of media attention didn't just affect public opinion, it caught the eye of the state's governor. Calls for clemency grew louder, with protests and rallies held outside government buildings. People were marching, demanding justice not just for James, but for all those who had been forgotten behind bars. The petition to spare his life gained hundreds of thousands of signatures, each one an echo of a simple wish: a man and his dog, one last time. James, unaware of the growing storm outside the prison walls, clung to the final moment he had shared with Daisy. He never could have predicted the outpouring of support, nor the impact that single, quiet reunion would have. It seemed in some way that his life, his final moments, had taken on new meaning, as if the love between him and his dog had sparked a fire that could not easily be extinguished. Outside the prison walls, the movement to save James gained momentum. Every day, more voices were raised in his defense. People who had never heard of him before, people who had never even considered the human side of those on death row, found themselves moved by the image of James holding Daisy. They saw it as a symbol of redemption, a symbol of the possibility for change even in the most unforgiving circumstances. The bond between James and his dog had become a rallying cry for justice reform, for second chances, and for mercy. The growing public outcry soon reached the ears of those who held the power to change James' fate. The governor, who had initially remained silent, found himself unable to ignore the overwhelming support for James. He was inundated with messages, emails, and phone calls from people pleading for clemency. The petition to spare James' life had gained traction, and for the first time, the governor's office began to seriously consider the case. James, however, remained unaware of the storm that had been stirred in his name. As he sat in his cell that evening, the familiar isolation of his existence settled back around him. The reunion with Daisy, though heartwarming, was still fresh in his mind, and he couldn't help but replay every moment of it. He thought of her soft, trusting eyes and how she had nuzzled him as though nothing had changed. For that brief time, he felt the weight of his past lift, if only for a moment. But now he was back to the harsh reality of prison, with nothing but the ticking of the clock to remind him of how little time he had left. The prison had promised to allow him this one final moment of peace, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. As he sat on his cot, the soft murmur of guards' voices drifting from the hallway, he found himself praying. Not for forgiveness, not for a miracle, but for the chance to prove that he was more than his worst mistake. He wanted to live, to atone for what he had done, to show the world that he was capable of redemption. It was then, as James closed his eyes, that he heard the sound of footsteps approaching his cell. The heavy door creaked open, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway, the warden. But this time, there was something different in his expression. There was no grim authority, no distant politeness. The warden looked, conflicted, almost uncertain. "James," the warden said, his voice low but not unkind. "There's been a development." James' heart skipped a beat. He stood up slowly, unsure of what to expect. What kind of development? The warden hesitated, glancing behind him before stepping into the cell. "The governor has agreed to stay your execution for now. They're reviewing your case, considering clemency." For a moment, James couldn't process the words. His mind raced, his breath catching in his throat. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath him. What does that mean?" "It means," the warden continued, his voice gentle but firm, "that you have more time. They're reconsidering your sentence." The weight of the words hit James like a tidal wave. More time. Could it be? Was it possible that everything, his final wish, the plea for mercy, the voices of the public, had truly changed his fate? His legs suddenly felt weak, and he staggered back slightly, trying to grasp the enormity of what he had just heard. The warden watched him silently, giving him space to process the news. I don't know what to say," James murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He was overwhelmed, his thoughts tumbling over each other. But the one thing that stood out was this: he was being given a second chance. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. James sat quietly in his cell, the news still echoing in his mind. The warden had left him with a promise that the governor would make a final decision in the coming weeks. But for the first time in what felt like forever, James had something to hold on to, something more than just the certainty of his end. He had hope. Days passed, each one dragging with the weight of uncertainty. His routine in the prison continued, but there was a different energy about him. Guards who had previously seen only the hardened exterior of James now noticed something different in him. He was calmer, more focused, his eyes not as heavy with the burden of despair. It wasn't that he had forgotten what awaited him. It was simply that, for the first time in years, he felt the faintest possibility of a future. Daisy had returned to the shelter, but her presence lingered in James' heart. Every night before he went to sleep, he would close his eyes and picture her tail wagging, her soft fur, her trusting eyes. She had given him the peace he hadn't realized he'd been searching for, and now that peace stayed with him, even as the uncertainty of his fate loomed. The ripple effect of James' story continued to grow outside the prison walls. The petitions had gathered enough signatures to make a real impact. The media coverage didn't stop. Journalists, lawyers, and activists alike kept pushing for justice, for mercy, for a second chance. James' case had become a symbol of the brokenness in the justice system, a reminder that people were not just their mistakes, and that redemption was possible. Eventually, after weeks of deliberation, the governor's office made its decision. James was granted clemency. His death sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The news hit James like a wave crashing against the shore. He had expected the worst, braced for the finality of his fate. But instead, he was given the chance to live. The life he would live would not be free, but it would be a life nonetheless. And for the first time in years, he felt a deep, profound sense of relief. In the days that followed, James received letters from all over the country, some from strangers who had been touched by his story, others from family members and supporters who had rallied behind him. People expressed their belief in his ability to change, to find redemption, to live a life worthy of the second chance he had been given. But for James, the most significant moment came when he received a letter from the shelter where Daisy was staying. It was brief, but it spoke volumes. The shelter had been following the story, and in recognition of his newfound chance at life, they had arranged something special. They were bringing Daisy back to visit him. When the day arrived, James was once again taken to the yard. His heart raced as he waited, and when Daisy stepped out of the van, her familiar golden fur gleaming in the sunlight, James' heart nearly burst with joy. She ran toward him without hesitation, her tail wagging just as it had before. As she leaped into his arms once more, James felt the weight of his journey, his past, his mistakes, and the second chance he had been granted, all melt away in the warmth of her presence. In that moment, James knew that no matter what the future held, he had been given the greatest gift of all, not just the chance to live, but the chance to make amends, to become a man worthy of the love that had always been there, waiting for him. And for that, he would be forever grateful.